What if I told you the 1960s weren't just peace signs and flower power, but also home to movies so shocking that censors practically buried them alive? Films that made critics faint, politicians rage, and theater owners lock the reels in vaults. How could a single decade produce so many scandals on screen? Stay tuned, because we're diving into 15 explosive 60s films that rattled Hollywood and vanished from view, until daring audiences brought them back. Psycho, 1960. Alfred Hitchcock didn't just release a thriller in 1960. He dropped a bomb on American cinema. Psycho opened with something unheard of at the time: an unmarried couple sharing a room. That alone got church groups fuming. But then came the infamous shower scene. Moviegoers screamed, fainted, even ran out of theaters. Some theaters actually installed smelling salts for audience emergencies. Critics slammed it as sick. The New York Times called it a blot on the industry. Hitchcock leaned into the chaos. He banned late entry into screenings, forcing theaters to put up huge signs. No one admitted after the picture begins. Lines wrapped around city blocks. Fans were terrified, but couldn't look away. What really made censors panic was the idea of a killer who looked ordinary. Norman Bates wasn't a monster in a mask. He was a polite motel clerk who could live next door. That scared people far more than any rubber-suited creature ever could. For years, television stations refused to show it uncut. Critics tried to bury Hitchcock's experiment as tasteless. Yet the audience had the final word, turning Psycho into one of the most profitable films of the decade. Ironically, the very movie some wanted hidden ended up inventing the modern horror film. Today, the shower scene is studied frame by frame, but back then, it was treated like a crime. Spartacus, 1960. On the surface, Spartacus looked like another grand Roman epic, with Kirk Douglas waving swords and marching armies. But behind the sandals and chariots was a political firestorm. Why? The script was written by Dalton Trumbo, a screenwriter blacklisted in the 1940s for refusing to testify before Congress. Hollywood had sworn never to let him work again. Douglas tore up that unspoken rule by putting Trumbo's real name on the credits. That single credit set off shockwaves. Politicians called for boycotts. The American Legion attacked the movie as un-American. Some theaters flat out refused to screen it. Studio bosses panicked, afraid Douglas had sunk millions into a project that would never be allowed to succeed. But audiences packed theaters anyway. The controversy helped fuel ticket sales, turning Spartacus into a hit that broke the blacklist's power. The battles didn't end there. Censors tried to cut out entire sections. The Roman bathhouse scene was considered far too suggestive, and for decades, it was missing from most versions. Douglas himself admitted he had to fight tooth and nail to keep the film intact. The missing footage was only restored decades later, long after audiences had already crowned Spartacus a legend. In the end, Spartacus wasn't just about slaves rising up against Rome. It was about artists rising up against censorship. It cracked open the blacklist and changed Hollywood forever. What began as a risky gamble became a cultural turning point, though many who lived through the controversy tried to pretend it never happened. The Manchurian Candidate, 1962. Imagine making a political thriller about a brainwashed soldier trained to assassinate a presidential candidate, and then watching the real president get killed in Dallas just a year later. That's what doomed The Manchurian Candidate. Directed by John Frankenheimer and starring Frank Sinatra, it hit audiences like a punch to the gut. It was stylish, clever, and terrifyingly plausible. But once President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, The Manchurian Candidate went from edgy entertainment to something far too real. Distributors yanked it from circulation. Some said Sinatra himself ordered it withdrawn because the parallels were so disturbing. For years, it was nearly impossible to find a copy. Critics whispered that Hollywood had locked it away on purpose, as if it was too dangerous to let people watch. The film's power came from how ordinary it all seemed. A decorated soldier, controlled without knowing it. A cold-hearted mother manipulating politics. A plot that felt ripped straight from headlines. When real tragedy struck, audiences couldn't separate fiction from fact. The movie simply vanished. It wasn't until the late 1980s that The Manchurian Candidate resurfaced in wide release. By then, it had gained mythical status as the banned Sinatra movie. Watching it today, the film still carries that unsettling chill. Back in the 60s, though, it was too close for comfort. Hidden like a secret file no one wanted opened. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? 1966. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton weren't just a Hollywood power couple. They were fire and gasoline. And Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was the match. Adapted from Edward Albee's play, the film trapped viewers in a living room with two people tearing each other apart with insults, drinking, and mind games. Censors hated it. Why? Because every line of dialogue dripped with language that Hollywood's outdated code had banned for decades. The studio begged director Mike Nichols to tone it down. He refused. Taylor's character Martha called people screwballs, and worse. That may sound tame today, but in 1966, it was practically dynamite. The Catholic Legion of Decency demanded cuts. Theaters hesitated. The MPAA, stuck in the past, didn't know what rating to slap on it. Instead of banning it outright, they invented a new label, suggested for mature audiences only. That was the crack in the dam that eventually led to the Moderns rating system. The scandal only added to its mystique. Audiences flocked to see Taylor and Burton tear each other to shreds, as if watching a demolition derby of marriage. The film went on to win 5 Oscars, proving that controversy could pay off. But, in its first release, plenty of towns refused to show it at all. For them, this wasn't art. It was Hollywood finally admitting that adults talked the way real adults actually did. Bonnie and Clyde, 1967. When Bonnie and Clyde hit theaters in 1967, critics were horrified. Not just shocked, furious. The New York Times called it a cheap piece of work. Why? Because Arthur Penn's film about 2 Depression-era bank robbers treated violence with a kind of strange beauty. Bullets flew in slow motion, blood splattered like ballet, and audiences gasped. Some called it immoral. Others said it was revolutionary. At first, the movie tanked. Warner Brothers nearly pulled it from theaters after a disastrous opening. But then, young audiences started showing up in droves. They weren't scandalized. They were electrified. Word spread, and soon, Bonnie and Clyde were icons of rebellion. Meanwhile, censors begged the studio to cut scenes, especially the final shootout. The answer was no. The backlash was intense. Some theaters refused to screen it. Politicians accused it of glorifying criminals. One critic even said it was a slap in the face to law enforcement. But what they missed was the larger picture. Bonnie and Clyde captured the disillusionment of the 60s. It showed that authority wasn't always heroic, that the so-called good guys didn't always win. That was a message young people understood instantly. The final irony? The film that was supposed to be hidden and shamed ended up launching the entire new Hollywood movement. Suddenly, gritty realism and anti-heroes were in demand. Bonnie and Clyde died in a hail of bullets, but their movie rewrote the rules of cinema. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, 1967. By the time Guess Who's Coming to Dinner premiered, Sidney Poitier was already Hollywood's most respected black actor. But even he couldn't save the film from controversy. The story was simple. A young white woman brings home her fiancé, a successful black doctor, to meet her liberal parents. Sounds tame today, right? In 1967, it was dynamite. Why? Because interracial marriage was still illegal in many U.S. states. The Supreme Court's Loving v. Virginia ruling legalizing it had happened only months before the movie's release. That meant this wasn't just a story, it was a statement. And statements made censors nervous. Some theaters in the South flat out refused to show it. Newspapers debated whether Hollywood had gone too far. Behind the scenes, Even the studio was nervous. The script was softened to avoid any physical intimacy that might inflame audiences further. Poitier himself was frustrated, saying he was tired of being cast as the perfect black man, brilliant, polite, flawless. Critics accused the film of playing it too safe. But audiences, they showed up anyway, many curious just to see what the fuss was about. The film went on to win 2 Oscars, but its legacy is bigger than awards. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner forced audiences to confront the hypocrisy of tolerant people who still recoiled when ideals became reality. For years afterward, TV networks hesitated to air it uncut. And yet today, it stands as a time capsule of a cultural clash America wasn't ready to face. The Graduate, 1967. The Graduate looked like a coming-of-age comedy, but it became one of the most controversial films of the decade. Dustin Hoffman played Benjamin Braddock, a confused college grad drifting through a haze of boredom and expectations. What set people off was the story of a young man pulled into a forbidden relationship with an older woman. Hollywood had never tackled suburban discontent with such bluntness. Critics were split down the middle. Some hailed it as genius, others slammed it as immoral and cheap. Religious groups demanded it be banned in multiple cities. What shocked them most wasn't the content alone, it was the tone. Director Mike Nichols filmed suburbia not as a cozy dream, but as a suffocating trap. Empty swimming pools, hushed cocktail parties, and the famous Simon and Garfunkel soundtrack turned middle-class comfort into a nightmare. Audiences, especially young ones, ate it up. They saw their own frustrations reflected on screen. The idea that the American dream could be hollow was considered outrageous in 1967. But by the film's end, when Benjamin and Elaine sit silently on that bus, not smiling, not triumphant, but lost in uncertainty, it left people shaken. Censors hated how much the film got away with. They argued that its tone mocked American values. Studio executives worried about bans, but Nichols refused to water it down. The result? A blockbuster that shattered expectations, won Oscars, and proved a film could be both scandalous and wildly profitable. For years, critics tried to dismiss it as a gimmick. Instead, The Graduate became the blueprint for movies about generational rebellion. Cool Hand Luke, 1967. Paul Newman's blue eyes may have made headlines, but Cool Hand Luke made history by challenging authority on screen in ways Hollywood rarely allowed. The film followed Luke, a petty criminal sent to a brutal Southern chain gang. What got it into trouble wasn't just the violence, it was the underlying message. Authority is cruel, the system is broken, and rebellion has dignity. From the start, censors bristled. Scenes of Luke being beaten, tortured, and humiliated tested the limits of what was acceptable. The infamous egg-eating contest became a cultural joke, but for censors, it was another reminder of the film's unrelenting tone of defiance. When Luke mocks the prison guards with his catchphrase, "What we've got here is failure to communicate," it became an anthem of rebellion that struck a nerve across America. Authorities weren't amused. Some theaters in the South refused to show it, claiming it insulted law enforcement. Studio executives tried to downplay the controversy, but audiences loved it. They saw Luke as a martyr for individuality at a time when protests and counterculture movements were redefining society. The legacy of Cool Hand Luke is that it dared to portray authority figures not as noble protectors, but as flawed and even cruel. It was too much for censors at the time, and yet audiences embraced it, keeping the legend alive. What was once a lightning rod is now considered one of the greatest American films ever made. The Wild Angels, 1966. Roger Corman's The Wild Angels didn't just stir controversy, it set fire to the establishment. Starring Peter Fonda and Nancy Sinatra, the film followed a biker gang as they rode, fought, and defied every norm of polite society. In 1966, this wasn't entertainment. To many Americans, It was a threat. What rattled people most wasn't just the lawlessness. It was the attitude. The gang wasn't punished in tidy Hollywood fashion. They partied, fought with cops, and tore through small towns without remorse. Conservative critics saw it as glamorizing rebellion. Parent groups demanded bans. In the UK, the film was outright banned until 1972. In America, it played mostly in drive-ins and grindhouses, often under police protest. Corman leaned into the fury. He marketed it with the tagline, "We want to be free, to ride our machines without being hassled by the man." That line was lifted straight from the film and became a counterculture rallying cry. To censors, it was an open declaration of war. For decades, The Wild Angels was treated like a bad influence, too dangerous for TV. But looking back, it was the opening shot in a new era of American cinema. Without it, there would be no Easy Rider. It captured a counterculture mood long before Hollywood was ready to embrace it. The very chaos that got it buried is exactly what made it unforgettable. The Trip, 1967. If The Wild Angels shocked parents, The Trip terrified them. Directed by Roger Corman and written by Jack Nicholson, the film was one of the first mainstream attempts to portray an LSD experience. Peter Fonda played a man drifting through psychedelic visions while wandering Los Angeles. On screen, colors warped, reality bent, and traditional storytelling dissolved into kaleidoscopic chaos. Censors went ballistic. They accused the film of promoting drug culture at a time when LSD was making headlines as a social menace. The UK banned it outright, calling it dangerous propaganda. In the US, theater owners faced local protests and occasional police raids. Critics dismissed it as trash. Theaters marketed it as an educational trip. But everyone knew it was part of a cultural shift Hollywood was afraid to touch. What made it even more infamous was how accurate it felt to many young viewers experimenting with new lifestyles. To them, The Trip wasn't irresponsible. It was honest. That honesty scared the establishment even more. The film was chopped up, censored, and buried in television vaults for decades. Ironically, The Trip ended up being one of the most financially successful independent films of the decade. It opened the door for experimental filmmaking in Hollywood, even as it was condemned in newspapers. Looking back, it may seem tame compared to what came later. But in 1967, this movie was treated like a national emergency. It was too real, too bold, and too unwilling to play by the rules. Valley of the Dolls, 1967. When Valley of the Dolls premiered, the ads promised glamour, drama, and scandal. What audiences got was a raw look at women in show business struggling with fame, pressure, and pill addiction. For 1967, this was practically radioactive. Critics called it dirty, cheap, and dangerous. Some even demanded it be pulled from theaters. The real issue wasn't just the storyline. It was the exposure of Hollywood's dark underbelly. The film showed rising stars pressured into false promises, discarded when they aged, and medicating themselves just to survive. That hit too close to home. The studios, desperate to protect their image, distanced themselves from the movie. Newspapers ran editorials claiming it was corrupting youth. In certain towns, theater owners faced local bans and boycotts. Despite the backlash, audiences poured in. The controversy made it irresistible. People lined up not just for the story, but for the chance to see what Hollywood didn't want them to see. Some theaters even bragged that they hadn't cut the offending scenes. The result was a box office hit that critics hated, but fans couldn't stop watching. For years, Valley of the Dolls was treated as trash cinema, buried in late-night showings, or chopped up on TV. But its reputation has grown. Today, it's remembered as one of the first films to reveal that beneath the glitz of stardom, there's a whole lot of darkness. Back then, though, it was branded a scandal. Midnight Cowboy, 1969. Midnight Cowboy didn't just break rules, it obliterated them. Released in 1969, it told the story of Joe Buck, a Texas drifter who moves to New York City dreaming of success, only to be swallowed by loneliness and exploitation. Paired with Dustin Hoffman's unforgettable Ratso Rizzo, the film was gritty, bleak, and unrelenting. Critics didn't know what to do with it. The biggest shock came when the MPAA slapped it with an X rating, the same category used for films considered inappropriate for respectable theaters. Suddenly, Midnight Cowboy was branded unfit for mainstream audiences. Many theaters refused to screen it. Advertisers pulled support. In some states, it was effectively banned. Yet the controversy only added fuel to the fire. What scared people wasn't just the subject matter, it was the blunt honesty. The film showed a New York stripped of glamour, a city of hustlers, poverty, and broken dreams. No tidy endings, no uplifting message, just raw reality. For many, that was too much. Then came the twist. Despite all the controversy, Midnight Cowboy won the Academy Award for Best Picture, the only X-rated movie ever to do so. Overnight, it went from scandal to legend. But for years, networks refused to air it uncut, and it was whispered about more than it was actually seen. Easy Rider, 1969. By the end of the decade, one movie captured the counterculture like no other. Easy Rider, directed by Dennis Hopper and starring Peter Fonda and Jack Nicholson, wasn't just a road movie. It was a rebellion on wheels. Two bikers ride through America, fueled by freedom and chased by paranoia. It made audiences cheer and made authority figures panic. The film's controversy came from its open defiance of tradition. Characters openly challenged police, politicians, and middle America. The free-spirited lifestyle it portrayed made conservative critics furious. Some states tried to block screenings altogether, claiming the movie encouraged lawlessness. The violent ending shocked audiences and enraged censors, who argued it was irresponsible. But young people saw it differently. For them, Easy Rider was the movie that finally spoke their language. It captured the generational divide in 2 hours of music, motorcycles, and confrontation. The studio system didn't see it coming. Made for under $500,000, it grossed tens of millions. Suddenly, Hollywood realized the kids they had ignored were the ones filling theaters. Behind the scenes, the chaos mirrored the story. Hopper's directing was erratic, tempers exploded, and editing was a nightmare. That messiness only added to the legend. When it hit theaters, it didn't just shock the establishment. It redefined what movies could be. For years, Easy Rider was censored on television and considered too dangerous for casual audiences. Today, it's remembered as the film that cracked the system wide open. But in 1969, it was treated like a cultural warning siren. The Pawnbroker, 1964. The Pawnbroker wasn't a big-budget spectacle, but it became one of the most controversial American films of the decade. Directed by Sidney Lumet, it told the story of Saul Nazerman, a Holocaust survivor running a pawn shop in Harlem. What rattled audiences wasn't just the bleak story, it was the way it was told. For decades, Hollywood's production code had banned certain content outright. The Pawnbroker ignored those rules. It depicted despair, moral decay, and corruption with a frankness that was unheard of. The censors tried to block it, but Lumet fought back. He even convinced the code's administrators to grant a special exemption, the first of its kind. That single decision cracked the door open for all the controversial films that followed. Some critics hailed it as a masterpiece. Others attacked it as exploitative and too harsh. In certain cities, the film was pulled from theaters for being inappropriate for the public. For decades afterward, it remained difficult to find, treated as a risky title. Looking back, the film's greatest controversy wasn't one scene, it was the mood. It forced audiences to face despair without a sugar-coated resolution. That was almost unthinkable in American cinema before 1964. The fact that it exists at all is proof of how the 1960s tore down old Hollywood rules, and forced the industry to grow up. Cape Fear, 1962. Before Scorsese remade it in the 1990s, Cape Fear was already a lightning rod. Directed by J. Lee Thompson and starring Gregory Peck and Robert Mitchum, the film told the story of a convicted criminal stalking the family of the lawyer who put him behind bars. It wasn't just suspense, it was menace, stretched across every frame. The controversy hit immediately. Critics argued the film was far too violent and disturbing for mainstream release. The implications of Mitchum's predator-like role were considered unbearable. Some theaters refused to show it. Television censors banned it from airing for decades, claiming it was unfit for family viewing. What made it so shocking was Mitchum's performance. His Max Cady wasn't a cartoon villain. He was calm, calculating, and relentless. That made audiences squirm. The idea that such evil could hide under a polite smile terrified people. Even Gregory Peck admitted the film was darker than anything he had expected. Despite the backlash, Cape Fear became a classic of psychological suspense. Yet for years, it was treated like a film too poisonous to air without heavy editing. Networks chopped entire scenes, trying to dull the impact. They failed. The menace lingered no matter how much they cut. Today, it's praised as groundbreaking. But in 1962, it was almost too much for audiences to bear. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what the censors try to hide. So there you have it. 15 movies from the 1960s, so controversial they were practically erased, buried, or chopped to pieces. They shocked critics, enraged censors, and left audiences whispering long after the credits rolled. But history has a funny way of turning outrage into legend. Which of these hidden gems surprised you most? Drop your thoughts below. Subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories. And remember, sometimes the films they tried to bury are the ones that live forever.